Hello everyone, and welcome to the first DesalData webinar of 2024. This is the first non-subscriber webinar that we've done in a little while, so there's a few more of you joining than usual. We're going to be going over a few different topics that I'll get to in just a moment, but first of all, my name is Hugo Birch. I'm the Desalination and Reuse Editor here at GWI, so I'm responsible for our DesalData market intelligence platform. Joining me is Tom Pankratz, the editor of Water Desalination Report, and together we're going to be going through a variety of different topics. We're going to start off by looking at the state of the desalination and reuse markets at the moment, pulling data from our most recent forecasts. So looking at some numbers for both capacity and expenditure. Then we're going to look at a few bits of information taken from the Desalination and Reuse report that we published at the end of last year, before moving into the forecasts proper and looking at what the outlook is for the next 5 or so years, starting, of course, with 2024. And then after I finish with that, I will be having a bit of a discussion with Tom, and we'll be talking a little bit about the process behind Water Desalination Report, as well as touching on the upcoming Tech Idol session at this year's Global Water Summit, which is happening in London in April. Throughout, you will be able to submit questions, and we will have time at the end to go through those. So please do send those through whenever you have them, and we'll get to those at the end and try and give you some good answers. So without further ado, I'd like to kick things off by looking at some historical numbers for desalination and wastewater reuse. So these charts are taken from the most recent Desalination and Reuse Handbook we've published, and this involves collecting data on projects in both areas, from suppliers, developers, equipment providers from all around the world over the course of a year. So all of this data is grounded in real projects. Those of you who've attended subscriber webinars will know this already, and I'll try not to be too repetitive for you. But what we're looking at here is a chart that shows the progression and growth of desalination and reuse over the past 20 years since 2003. So what we've got here is blue lines for reuse and green for desalination. And the blocks, the bars, those are for contracted capacity, so projects that have reached financial close, and the installed is just anything that has been constructed. So that doesn't account for whether it is subsequently being brought offline, but gives an indicator of how things have progressed in terms of realistically taking those contracts and bringing them to fruition. But what we really see here, the key story, is that reuse is significantly larger than desalination by capacity. And in a number of ways, this isn't an enormous surprise. Of course, the technology used in many reuse projects is less stringent in its treatment level than with desalination. It's less expensive. And so projects can be larger for substantially lower costs. And that's really what contributes to these substantially higher figures that are now above 250 million cubic meters a day cumulative contracted for reuse. We've also seen a sharp increase in reuse capacity over the past 5 years. A lot of that is driven by growth in China, and I will come to touch on that in a bit more detail in a little bit. But by contrast with desalination, we see more steady growth, and we'll see the fluctuations in that on a yearly basis in a bit more detail on one of the subsequent slides. But I just wanted to throw this up to begin with to just give a bit of a picture on where we're at with the industry at the moment, how solutions to water scarcity are looking, and how the balance is between reuse and desalination. Moving to look at another chart that I've pulled out from the handbook. This is one looking at the breakdown of desal capacity, broken down by private sector involvement. So you'll see here on the different categories we have the percentage of annual contracted capacity by DBO, IWPP, BOT, BOO, and HA. And those are, for those of you who are not familiar, design, build, operate, independent water and power projects, build, operate, transfer, and build, own, operate. And then HA is hybrid annuity, which is a rather more novel concept for the desalination sector. And that's really only used in India. So the exact definitions of these, I won't go into a full breakdown of these on this webinar, but if anyone is interested in more of a breakdown and isn't familiar with them, please do send a message. Either we can get to that at the questions section at the end or in a follow-up email. But really what we see here with the trend is a shift away from IWPPs towards other private sector involvement, largely due to the shift away from thermal technology, which is really what has been what was behind those IWPPs, with co-locating desalination projects with thermal installations, so refineries or power plants to use the waste heat. And we can see that the correlation in a shift to membrane technology has really resulted in that procurement model becoming much less common. But what we also see is a significant growth in BOTs and BOOs. And that comes in with really encouraging developers to achieve greater efficiencies by having those developers take over the running of the plants that they put together for a certain period of time, meaning that they are responsible for paying the operating costs during that period. So you build an efficient plant, then you have to pay less operating costs. So it really encourages those efficiencies, and that's starting to become more of the norm certainly with large-scale desalination. We've seen this in the key markets of the Gulf and the GCC, Saudi Arabia and the UAE for quite a while now, but now we're starting to see more growth in some of the less traditional markets, particularly in North Africa. Morocco is pursuing PPPs, or public-private partnerships, through these kind of models with private sector involvement for their new capacity for their mega projects. The same is true of planned projects in Egypt. There's a large-scale building program underway, which is being run by their sovereign wealth fund, and that's going to be done using these private sector, privately financed procurement models. So although the total percentage looks about the same as what we've seen in previous years, going back to about 2007, there is a shift in the dynamics of this and also where this is occurring. So again, a bit of an interesting chart to quickly pull out and contextualize what we're looking at. I've also broken out a list of top desalination plant suppliers, which I think is always an interesting one to look at. There are a few things to touch on here. One is that the number of companies on this list that have won a significant volume of capacity is actually quite low. So above 1 million cubic meters a day, we're talking about less than 10 since 2014. So this is looking at contracted capacity. And if you see the red bars, those are indicating capacity that has been won in 2022 to 2023. And really, the companies coming out on top here are Wetico, Matito, Veolia, and Acciona. So not very many. And there are a few reasons for this, but this is really reflecting one of the trends in the market at the moment, which is that there are not very many EPC contractors willing to take on the risks involved in building large scale desalination plants, and margins are quite low, and comes as a result of this constant drive to reduce the cost of desalination. So in a way, there are not that many companies willing to sort of take this on, and that's one of the challenges facing the industry at the moment, and it's one of the things that we'll be looking to address in one of our sessions at the Global Water Summit in April. But again, this is quite a good reflection of what's going on dynamically. And if you are from a company that is a plant supplier or a membrane supplier or anything like that, and you're interested in making sure that your organization is properly reflected in the rankings that we do for these, we base all of this on individual projects. So all of the numbers behind these are based on real projects. And if you'd like to be included and make sure that that's all correct, please feel free to reach out to me, and we can discuss looking at making sure your projects are all properly included. One further dynamic with this that's been quite an interesting shift over the past few years within plant suppliers has been the shift towards GCC companies really taking on the EPC work. So we've got two charts here showing the same breakdown but for different years. The bottom one is contracted capacity by plant supplier based on headquarters region for 2012 to 2021 in percent. And the top one is the same for 2022 to 2023. And what we can see here is that historically, despite the GCC being the world's leading market for desalination projects, only about 12% of the capacity awarded has been going to GCC companies. And that has changed in recent years to become more like 41%. And that's coming as companies like Matito and Wetico have won projects outside the GCC, have broadened their horizons and started to expand and take that expertise of working in these leading markets to bring to new markets as they emerge. And briefly just want to cover this. This is a quick chart which again shows a ranking of different companies, this time for equity holders. So this is ranking plant owners and developers by their stake in all of the projects that they own. So we've got the blue bars here for equity capacity. That's calculated by taking the volume, the capacity of all of the projects that they are involved in and multiplying it by their ownership to give a reflection of how much they actually own. What we can see here is that the Saline Water Conversion Corporation, which is Saudi Arabia's publicly owned body, also known as SWEC, is out on top. And then we have Aquapower on the private side. And this is whether it's state-owned or privately controlled is indicated by the icons in the grey bar here. But again, generally what we can see is that capacity is concentrated among a fairly small number of equity holders. And this again reflects the shape of the market at the moment as being quite tight knit with a lot of capacity controlled by a small number of organizations. Just briefly, as I come to the end of the charts that I've pulled from the handbook, I just wanted to flag this up. We will be sending this around this presentation after, so no need to rush on this anytime as I'm going through this, but we're doing a 10% off deal for advertising in the handbook. This is one of the publications that we do on a yearly basis, and it has a very wide readership. So if you're interested in having your company featured and want to get a little bit of extra visibility for what you're offering, then you can use this code and just reach out to us, and we can get that all set up for you. But I now want to move into looking at a quick chart on the side of desalination economics. This is one that was pulled from the report that we did at the end of last year. Those of you who attended the subscriber webinar I did back in December will have seen this chart already. But what this shows is on the top, the trend in desal pricing since 2000, and then on the bottom, the trend in energy consumption since 1997. And in both cases, we can see the progress that the industry has been making in bringing down both costs and energy consumption. And of course, the latter is connected very closely with the idea of decarbonisation and progress towards net zero targets. So I think this is something where a lot of mainstream media talks about desalination as being something which is still cripplingly expensive and environmentally damaging. And I've seen many articles which are quoting numbers which are pulled from plants that are now 20 years old. But I think it is worth reflecting on the progress that we've made as an industry as a bit of inspiration to driving these to greater heights in the future, bringing down those costs still further and reducing energy consumption even more. So now to get into the meat of this presentation, to look at the forecasts. So I'm going to be starting off by looking at desalination before moving to touch on reuse. But first off, I wanted to briefly cover the methodology of this. As I've touched on already, the way that we work on DesalData is that we build everything from individual projects. So all of the capacity that we look at is tracked from those projects. Certainly on the historical side, we have a few models to account for projects we don't know about when looking to the future, but really it's tied to real projects. And so here I've just broken out a breakdown of the number of projects that we're tracking in different regions. So at the top, we've got a table for large projects over 100,000 cubic meters a day, and then on the bottom for plants smaller than that. So the total capacity that we're tracking for desalination projects on DesalData is 44.6 million cubic meters a day. So quite a large volume, and that's over about 270 projects, if memory serves. But then what we can see, taking all of those projects and putting them together with our historical data, is we start to get a bit of a picture on what the industry is looking like in terms of capacity. So here we have contracted capacity for seawater and brackish water desalination, the blue being for seawater and orange being for brackish water. The seawater is, of course, the largest component of this chart, which to anyone familiar with desalination already will not be a surprise. But really what we're seeing is a very strong boom in capacity expected over the next 5 years, with a peak in 2025. And there are a few different reasons for this. First off is the shift in climate change, worsening water scarcity, and just the demand for more water, particularly on the municipal side, which is demanding larger projects, bigger projects, and simply more projects. So that's point one. Point two is the replacement of old thermal capacity, which comes back to what I was talking about before, where now it is substantially more efficient to use a membrane-based plant rather than a thermal one, and so there is a drive to replace those old thermal installations with new membrane-based plants, which is contributing to both new greenfield and brownfield projects. And as well, the growth of desalination outside classical markets, so more markets taking interest in desalination as a solution to water scarcity. And so we see growth in traditional markets like Saudi Arabia, but also more growth in new ones like Egypt. Senegal is certainly emerging as a very new market for desalination. China is seeing more growth all around the world, and the result of this is that we're seeing record numbers for planned capacity over the next 5 years. On the brackish water side, things are rather, well, the numbers are rather lower, and this comes primarily as a result of the simply smaller plant sizes, but there's still quite a bit of interest, but slightly more muted than on the seawater side, where the big projects really are. Moving to look at expenditure, here we have a very similar chart showing CAPEX and OPEX, CAPEX in green and OPEX in blue. The chart here is slightly more evened out, so we don't see quite the same spikes as we did on the previous one. That's really a result on the CAPEX side of the fact that expenditure on big desalination projects does not happen all in one go as a plant is awarded, but over several years as it's built. And so we see a slightly smoother path, but again, a large spike going out towards the end of our forecast period. In this case, that delay in expenditure means that the peak is falling more in 2027 and 2025. But the real takeaway here is that we're seeing record numbers of investment opportunities, opportunities for plant suppliers, developers, all different stakeholders from across the desalination industry to get involved in new projects and winning new business. So to look at a bit more of a country breakdown, what we have here is a look at contracted seawater and brackish water desal in the GCC at the top and in the rest of the Middle East and North Africa at the bottom. A quick thing to notice that the scales on these two charts are not the same. On the top chart, the pale blue and dark blue are very dominant here. That's Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which, as I mentioned, they are the largest markets for seawater desal anywhere in the world. And what we can see is that there's a significant volume of capacity in these countries still expected to be awarded over the next 5 years, but a little bit of a tail off compared to the heights of 2019. I notice now that one of the numbers here says 2010, that should say 2020. But a little bit of a tail off, but we are going to still see a big spike in 2024. A lot of this is coming from independent water projects, so coming back to that idea of privately financed desalination. And we are expecting to see quite a lot of that in 2024 and 2025. On the public side, so the more classic EPC contracts without that private sector involvement, there are still certainly some on the cards, particularly in Saudi Arabia under SWAC. But as I mentioned previously, the trend is definitely towards those privately financed models. And that's really what we're seeing. There are a few independent water and power projects still expected, and those are really based in Qatar and Kuwait. Those have been on the cards for quite a while. I remember seeing those in our tracker when I first started doing these webinars, so it has certainly been a while. But there is certainly progress on those fronts. They aren't abandoned, and we may see those come through as some of the last remaining IWPPs from our tracker. Looking at the bottom, we see a bit more of a exciting shift from some lower numbers to higher numbers, going left to right. So as the capacity we're expecting from Saudi Arabia and the UAE starts to tail off a little bit, we're really seeing very strong growth in some of these other markets, particularly in Egypt. And that's predominantly coming from the privately financed program that I mentioned earlier, that's being run by the Sovereign Wealth Fund. A lot of that is expected to be procured in the next year or two, so 2025 and 2026. A couple of the phases of that are going to be tendered this year in Q1 of 2024. So that's the Matru desalination package and also the Red Sea desalination package. Those of you who are subscribers will have access to the details of the individual projects for these and can reach out if you want any more of a breakdown on this. And if you're not a subscriber, please also feel free to reach out and we can discuss this. We're also seeing strong growth in Morocco. So the large section of light blue at the bottom there on 2024 is from the Casablanca desalination plant. So that's a privately financed project on Morocco's coastline for seawater desal. And that was both phases of that were won by Acciona at the end of last year. That's one of the largest projects anywhere outside the GCC. So this really exemplifies the shift that we're seeing towards ever larger projects as well as growth outside of the very traditional markets. And there are a few other projects which are expected to be following this up. There's the Nador desalination project where an RFP is expected early in 2024. So again, quite an exciting time for project tenders this year. There's also a few projects expected in Tunisia, but typically much smaller, and as well in Israel, but those are more long-term plans. Algeria has had a big run of projects in the last couple of years, particularly in 2022 and 2023, and there are some projects expected to follow up on this, some large-scale ones in the range of about 300,000 cubic meters a day each, which will be strong opportunities for people to get involved in. But the details of those are a little bit hazy at the moment. We don't know exactly where they're going to fall, which is why you will not see that reflected in this particular chart. Moving to look at some other markets, there are a few things to pick out here. One is the dark green section here for China. China has a similar to Egypt, a large-scale building program underway for seawater desalination, and that's why there's that uptick in capacity in 2026 to 2028 for the dark green. This will connect in as well with the interest in pursuing reuse, which I'll be coming to in just a moment, but in general terms, looking at responses to water scarcity and really, particularly in the northeast of China, where there's a lot of water scarcity issues and where drought is going to be hitting hard as climate change worsens. Taiwan is also an interesting example to pick out from here. There are a series of large-scale projects above 100,000 cubic meters a day that are expected to be tendered over the next few years. So again, we're seeing stronger growth in some of these other countries which have historically not seen so much capacity. For those projects, some of that is expected to be for municipal use, but as well for industrial end use and supplying Taiwan's very large semiconductor market, so the fabs for those microelectronics industries. Elsewhere, India has had a strong year last year with the largest project they've ever had, which is a 400,000 cubic meter a day project in Chennai. The future for more projects on this front, the projects are a little bit smaller than this. There's one which is expected to have the bid due sometime this year, which is in Mumbai, which will be a 200,000 cubic meter a day project. But otherwise, the project's a little bit smaller. There were a series of projects awarded under the hybrid annuity model, which is sort of a bit like a crossover between an independent water project model like a BOO or a BOT and a classic EPC contract, where part of the financing is done by the state and part through private finance. So it's a bit of a blend, which has worked very successfully for wastewater, but has been a little bit less successful for desalination. So it's a little bit unclear whether that's going to be taken forward as a procurement model for getting Indian projects off the ground, but there is certainly a pipeline of new capacity expected, albeit a little bit smaller than what we've seen in the last year or so. Otherwise, not exactly on this chart, but Mexico has a pipeline of new capacity. Sonora, the state of Sonora, for those of you who do read WDR, have access to that, will have seen a recent story that Tom put together on 3 new desalination plants that are included in the state water plan. So this is a state which is historically seen not too much on the desal front, but could open the doors for some larger projects in future. And then the last thing I want to touch on here is the Latin America angle, so Chile and Peru. The large section of light blue here for Chile, that is coming from the CRAMSA project, which will be a very large scale project to rival the size of those in the Middle East, which we're expecting to see be tendered over the next few years. Otherwise, there's also been some regulatory changes in Chile, with some new legislation that will mean that it's more possible to put projects together to serve municipal end use. So again, potentially quite a rich environment for encouraging new project growth, and we may see that as we get into future years, that blue section will get a bit larger. So to move to the reuse side of things, again, I'm going to just start off briefly with looking at the current picture. So this is cumulative installed reuse capacity by region in million cubic meters a day. And this really gives a good picture of how things are, of how capacity is distributed across the world. And what we can see is that the 3 big regions here are North America, the Middle East and North Africa, and East Asia Pacific. And there are a few things that you can take away from this chart. So the different shades in these bars, those are for the different years. So the lightest shade is 2019, the darkest is 2028. So you can see the progression over time. And what you can see with North America is a very even, steady progression in increasing capacity. Which we're forecasting to happen for a variety of reasons, but generally this is a result of steady growth from smaller scale projects, which result in that slightly more even spread. Middle East and North Africa is very different, and you'll see there are 2 big jumps on that section of the chart, and those come from very large scale agricultural projects. So those jumps are individual single projects, both in Egypt, and these are, well, in excess of 5 million cubic meters a day. One is 7.5 million cubic meters a day. So enormous plants, and that's why we see this slight dynamic shift where it's not quite a smoother progression, because the plant sizes are simply drastically larger. Then East Asia and Pacific, a lot of that is coming from China. Again, there are some jumps. A lot of this is from the Chinese government setting reuse targets, so saying that urban reuse has to be 25% by 2025. In some areas, up to 35%. So really making use of that treated wastewater and significantly increasing the national volume of reuse. There's also been encouragement of reuse building as part of the Chinese government's response to COVID, with a lot of state infrastructure bonds being issued to encourage the development of this and encourage economic recovery from the pandemic. But that's why we're seeing that very rapid acceleration in capacity building. So here to drill down a little bit more detail, here again we have the breakdown of capacity by region. On the left we've got additional installed, so that's showing how much per year, and on the right cumulative installed, so that's up to 2023 for the dark blue, and then between 2023 and 2028 for the light blue. So again, we can see that there's been a lot of growth in the past few years, but we are expecting to see that tail off a little bit. One thing to take note of here is the 2 big sections of green on the left chart for 2021 and 2023, and those are those large scale projects in Egypt, which do slightly distort the figures on this. But in general, the trend that we're seeing is a little bit more of the market settling down from a period of very high volumes, and a lot of that is connected to what I just mentioned about the situation in China and how those targets are set for 2025. So going beyond 2025, we're expecting to see Chinese reuse capacity sort of slightly start to settle down. Similarly, we can see on the following slide, here we go, a breakdown of capacity by sector and region. So when we're looking at reuse capacity on DesalData, the fundamental aspect of this that we're considering is where that water is being reused. And if there's not a clear indicator of beneficial reuse, then we don't include it. So this is a very important metric for us. But here you can see how the different regions in this chart at the top, how the distribution of different sectors breaks down by different regions. So the orange section for industry is very, very big in East Asia, Latin America, Southern Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas agricultural irrigation is much more dominant in the Middle East and North Africa and Western Europe. And there are a few different other parts to this. Of course, domestic potable use is something which is on the rise at the moment. So this can be either indirect or indirect potable reuse, IPR, or direct, DPR. Historically, DPR, where treated wastewater can be put straight back into a distribution network, has been very much limited in large scale applications to Namibia, which is really where that light blue section is coming from. But we're seeing growing interest around the world, particularly in North America. California has recently set some new standards for DPR. Those were approved in December, and there are certainly some challenges to that. But I think as we move forward, what we're expecting to see is a growth of that blue section around the world, particularly in North America, and there are a few other states that have been looking into that as well. And those of you who are familiar with the term toilet to tap, as is this idea of public opposition to direct potable reuse as being sort of somehow unhygienic, has been around for quite a while, ever since some projects in San Diego a while back. But we're finally starting to overcome that public perception issue. And really be able to bring the benefits of direct potable reuse as a solution to water scarcity. Looking at the bottom, we can see how this is expected to grow over time. We're expecting to see significant increases on the industrial front, as well as agricultural irrigation, and those are largely from the countries that I've already mentioned. Domestic potable use, we're expecting to see the real growth happen a little bit after the forecast period that we've got here, just as people as different organizations will need to meet the requirements. We'll have to find the capital to finance the different projects, and as well just meet the permits, which in areas like California, those of you who are familiar with desalination in California will know how much of a challenge that can be. So I will just quickly do a bit of a summary here. Main takeaways from the outlook that we've got at the moment is that the Q1 of this year is expected to be a very strong quarter for tenders. There are a few others as well expected throughout the rest of the year that will be strong opportunities for those stakeholders looking to get involved. Key markets to watch outside the GCC, which of course is continuing to be a very strong market, are North Africa, East Asia, Latin America, Israel more in the long term, as well as India. We're seeing a very strong pipeline of projects all around the world in this unique, almost perfect storm of factors that are driving the largest capacity boom in the industry's history. And we're seeing water price records being brought even lower despite the impact of inflation and increasing interest rates. That has been held up a little bit by the COVID pandemic, but still showing the progress that the industry has made over the past couple of decades. EPC contractors, the number of players is very low, and that is one of the areas that the industry is going to need to address going forwards. But we are seeing those GCC-based companies taking a bit more market share and a shift away from the more Euro-centric approach of some previous decades. High value reuse applications, we're also expecting to see strong growth. So those are really the potable reuse areas, so direct potable reuse in particular, which is going to require costly but effective technology. So this might be through reverse osmosis or other membrane-based technology, or a few other different avenues of approach. But in general, we're looking at the applications of reuse where there's a lot of money going to be going around, and that's where we're expecting to see the growth. So for those companies looking to get involved in reuse, we're expecting to see a lot of opportunities going forward, but we are also expecting to see the Chinese market for reuse slow a bit post 2025, but still remain quite strong. So that brings me to the end of my section. As I mentioned at the start of this, please do send through any questions that you might have, and we'll get to those at the end. But for now, I think we will move to talking a little bit about WDR. So, Tom, are you there?
I'm here.
Perfect. So I think what I wanted to do here is just ask you a little bit about your process for WDR. Maybe you could start off by just talking a little bit about what WDR is for those people on the call who aren't so familiar with it. So maybe just starting with that.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that, Hugo. And WDR, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is. Am I on yet? Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me, Hugo?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
You're coming through.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. And for those of you who aren't familiar with WDR, it's a weekly publication that's been written since 1965. I began writing it or editing it in 2005, and we do between 45 and 48 issues a year, taking off some of the holidays and also adding some special issues along the way. But it's 4 pages of what's going on in the desal community. One of the big subjects that people like to read about are the projects themselves, which we follow on a weekly basis from the RFQ stage right through to financial close and then commissioning. We do stories about companies and mergers, acquisitions, people. It includes updates on people as they get new jobs. I include their former position, their existing position, and their new email address. And we write about special subjects that are of interest to the community that are coming up. And reuse, as has just been pointed out by Hugo, is a growing issue. And there's been more stories about reuse, especially direct potable reuse, indirect and direct potable reuse. So, and not just desal stories, I should mention that, because we do stories on membrane projects in general, MBR projects, MFUF projects. Often they're the pretreatment for a desal process, but we do projects for standalone membrane projects in general. Brine is a big topic, especially now with brine mining. There's a lot of hype in the mainstream media, and I try to put a realistic twist on some of the hype that surrounds some of these subjects, and new equipment, new technologies. I write about some of the research ongoing, and just things that I think are interesting to the desal industry. And then there's, as the desal industry matures, so do desalters. And I include obituaries of desalters who've passed away recently. Oftentimes, some of these guys, especially the retired ones who were so instrumental in developing our industry, if they pass away after retirement, it often goes unnoticed because they don't have a link to the current industry. So we try to keep track of that kind of stuff, and just, again, try to target stories that would be of interest to the desal community as a whole.
Perfect. I think probably a follow-up question to this would be sort of how you go about selecting those stories and pinning those down and working out what to really cover, because there's a lot that goes on in the desal and reuse industries. So maybe could you just unpack that a little bit more?
Sure. Well, to write about this, well, first of all, I've been involved in the industry for 40 years, so I'm familiar with a lot of it. I've seen a lot of the history unfold, and I read a lot. I've also, the people that read WDR frequently send me stories or bring something to my attention that I might have missed. And every week, I go through it and spend most of my week reading stories, talking to people, and then towards the end of the week start highlighting ones that I think are most interesting. And the benchmark is usually, is it of interest to me? And I say that because I I have a pretty broad interest in the industry and think that it's proven to be fairly representative of what the readers like. There are things I miss, so it's great when someone sends me a story to write about. Uh, this week, for instance, I'm involved with the Saline Water Conversion Corporation, or SWICS, conducting a couple of meet and greets and meetings with people in both Texas and California, and I'm involved in the process and one of the forums that's being held, and so I'll write about that next week, as well as other things that have happened. But one of the things that I try to do is I try not to focus an issue on one subject. I recognize there's a lot of people with broad backgrounds who are focused on particular issues, and so I try to put in something that ticks all the boxes uh, that EPCs and OEMs might be interested in, that researchers might be interested in, that consulting engineers and suppliers. So I try to put a mix of stories together so that everybody finds at least something that is of interest to them, and hopefully gets them tangentially involved in other stories that are of interest. And one other thing to just mention: most stories are less than a half a page long, usually a quarter of a page to a half a page. Sometimes highly technical issues may require a little bit more than that, or complicated projects. But I try to write short and pretty tight, so I try to focus on the details, because everybody knows some of the basics that go into a big desal plant. So I try to look at the intake, or the boron removal issue, or the issues or the aspects of the plant that may be of particular interest for other people.
Mm-hmm. It is a wide range of things that you do cover in it, and I think just coming back to one of the things that you mentioned in your responses there is this idea about the growth of reuse, and to tie it into one of the things that I was talking about in my section is, I mean, how do you sort of, from the stories that you've been doing in WDR and the people that you've spoken to, how do you see the kind of relationship between direct potable reuse and indirect progressing in future? Do you think that there's a place for indirect potable reuse if we can get DPR right?
Yeah, sure. I found that there's a place for just about anything. There's a niche, a project here or there that may rely on it. But I think as we get comfortable with direct potable reuse, and it certainly appears that we're getting to that stage where people are familiar enough, and there's not the inherent fear that we had 20 years ago with reuse in general. And I think direct potable reuse in the relatively near future is probably going to be the way we do most of it. I mean, there's these regulations in California, and other regulations that are being developed and have been developed in Texas and Arizona and other states, uh, are addressing the key issues, and public
Mm-hmm.
health is the main one. And if we can do it and prove it and monitor real time the quality of the water that's being produced, uh, why pump it usually uphill? Because most wastewater plants take advantage of hydraulic gradients and are downhill or near the sea. Why pump it back uphill and put it in a reservoir for a couple of years, or pump it underground? Why not just put it right into the distribution system? So I think we're going to be talking about potable reuse rather than direct or indirect.
Mm-hmm.
And just like we talk about, there's a de facto indirect potable reuse, which we used to talk about, and that is, the natural potable reuse when a wastewater plant discharges water in a stream or upstream, and then it, it's just taken out downstream through a water plant and used. And that the differentiator, the de facto reuse is hardly used anymore. And I think it's the same is going to be with indirect potable reuse. And and I might even at this point make a little plug for one of the water reuse or rewater center that's been developed at University of Southern California with Trussell Technologies and the Department of Defense and the EPA have funded this center to look at potable reuse issues and put together a bi-monthly publication called the potable water report, potable reuse water report. Sorry, I can't think of it right off the top of my head. In which I'm going to be involved, helping to put that together, and kind of a WDR for the potable reuse industry. But yeah, it's a big deal, the direct potable reuse, and I think it's going to it's going to move pretty quickly. It is expensive, and but let's face it, water is getting more expensive, and as you find, as the contaminants that exist or uh, that are being dealt with now that we find in our natural water supplies are removed, there's more and more reuse, or excuse me, desalination, that is brackish water and seawater RO being required. Sea membranes, specifically RO membranes, to remove some of those contaminants. So conventional treatment is beginning to look more and more like desalination. So
Mhm.
anyway,
Well, perfect. Thank you very much. And I think it's nice to sort of look at the reuse angle as well, and kind of how that connects in as a solution together with desalination. It's all sort of part of the same kit for dealing with water scarcity. I'm quite conscious of the time, so I want us to have some good time to cover uh,
well, Hugo,
questions. Yes,
if I can interrupt you for a second, let me ask you a question based on your
sure.
report. I noticed when you had the seawater RO and brackish water RO, there was a big differentiator in the volumes, and you
Mhm.
addressed that there are small brackish water plants. But one thing I wanted to ask you is how do you go about keeping desal data up to date? Is it done on a real time basis? How big does a plant have to be to make it in desal data? And do you consider expansions? Just quickly, I think it would be good to let people know how you select plants, how they get in there.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So, essentially, with DesalData, we try to include every project that we can find, regardless of size. As a general rule, we try to track every or include every project above 500 cubic meters a day. In some cases, that's not always possible. Just when you start to get down to those very small plants, getting hold of the information can be quite difficult. But that is what we aim for. And the way that we collect this information, we do try and keep it up to date on a real time basis. We do the forecast updates once a quarter, but the inventory itself is updated twice a week. So if you have access to that through a DesalData subscription, then you'll be able to see those updates in real time, and you'll be able we tag the tracker updates so you can see not just in the data but also in a written way what's actually going on with plant tenders and updates like that. So yeah, we try and do it on a real-time basis as much as possible. We do a yearly data collection process, which is connected into the handbook. So that runs from around May to August. And for some of you on this call, you'll be hearing from me reaching out about this in the next couple of months or so. But we also welcome any information that we can receive about projects that anyone sends through. And if you have a project that you'd like featured on DesalData, or you'd like it to be us to do a little profile on it in the handbook, or consider it for an award, please do let us know about it. And we're very happy to include that and talk to you about what projects you've worked on and what's interesting about them. So that's kind of the process. And yeah,
Okay.
well, perfect. Um, As we're coming up towards the hour, I think I'd quite like to move to answering some of these questions because we have had quite a lot in. Um, while I'm going through these, I'll just move this to the final slide, so I can just have that sitting there. The first question that I've got here is about the place of disinfection in the reuse market and connected to membrane growth. whether there'll be a place for that, for disinfection. Yes, certainly. Disinfection is a very important step in meeting some of these stringent requirements, particularly for potable reuse. One of the aspects to this is the history of negative public perception about it. That means that these standards, like the ones that have been made in California, are very, very stringent on what needs to be done to treat the water, and as part of that, disinfection has a very important role. In terms of what type of technologies are going to be used, whether it's going to be something like UV or something a bit more chemical, that will, I think, depend on the individual cases, and there's probably not going to be a single rule that's going to be universally true for this. So I think as to whether there's going to be a primary technology, that's just something where we'll have to wait and see. Other questions that we've had come in, just a very simple one. Can I clarify what HA stood for again? Yes, that's hybrid annuity for the procurement model. Are we seeing desal or reuse projects for South Africa, Ghana, and Senegal? Yes, we are. So Senegal had a 50,000 cubic meter a day project that was awarded a couple of years ago, and they're investigating a follow-up to that will be bigger. So that will be in the mega project range, so more like 200,000 cubic meters a day or larger. That, as far as I am aware, is still in the pipeline. So we would be expecting to see Senegal grow as a market in future. South Africa, there are certainly some desal projects there, but there's really a lot more activity on the reuse side at the moment, particularly around Durban. So some quite big projects there, but desal is certainly being considered. And then for Ghana, there are some projects, but not really to the same extent as in South Africa, and certainly not to the same scale as what's being considered in Senegal. Tom, question for you. Will you again be running a Tech Idle event during the Global Water Summit in April?
I will. And in fact, I'm in the process right now of trying to identify 5 participants. I've got a couple that I'm pretty keen on including, and haven't had a time to reach out to anybody. I'll probably start that next week. But Tech Idle, for those of you who aren't aware, is something we've been doing at the Global Water Summit for, I think this will be the 15th or 16th year, where it's a kind of a pitch event. We invite 5 new technology companies to give an 8-minute presentation, and then go through the question and answer session with 4 desal experts. And we have the audience selects what they consider to be the winner or the best technology, the one that's most likely to live up to its expectations, and then the judges select one on their own, which is announced. Well, they announce a winner and a runner-up, and which they announce at the dinner that night. It's a pretty difficult thing. Well, first of all, there's a lot of prizes and contests nowadays, so it's a lot of. But this is a little bit different, and one of the challenges for those of us who run it is trying to select 5 interesting technologies that haven't already been, had a lot written about, and they're, trying to pick the best of 5 technologies that maybe from small handheld units up to innovations for mega projects is pretty difficult. It's not always apples and oranges thing, and we try to take into consideration who does the best job at presenting the business plan, how they protect their IP, a little bit about the technology itself, where it fits, what the market is, and so it's an interesting event, I think, and it's always well attended, and fortunately we've been it's been one of the first contests that a lot of the new technologies that you see being adopted have participated in when they were first breaking through. So we're in the process of it, and if someone knows of such a technology, let me know, because within the next few weeks we're going to be making the decisions and selecting the participants.
Yes, absolutely. And as I suppose this is a bit of a trend with all of this, but if you're interested in us covering anything that your organization is up to, do please reach out to us. And Tech Idle is a really good way to get some of those upcoming technologies looked at. And there've been some really good ones in the past. It's always a session worth attending. So I'd encourage anyone who's going to be coming to the Global Water Summit in April to come along to that. I'm going to be trying to be quick with some of these questions. We've got one on do you expect growth in desal and reuse due to hydrogen production? Yes, we do. It's a little bit of a difficult topic to pin down an exact number to. So those of you who have access to the full desal and reuse report that we did at the end of last year will have seen there's a section in there on green hydrogen and what it means for desal. There's a lot of capacity expected to be needed, so feed water for electrolyzers to make that hydrogen, but there are a few different options, and desal and reuse are not necessarily the only ones. But of the plants, of the hydrogen projects that we are tracking, about 10% of them have announced what their feed water source is going to be, and of those, about half of that is going to be desalination. So if that trend continues with the other projects that are in the pipeline, we would expect that kind of getting into the 2030s, we'll see some fairly large scale ones being procured to supply those electrolyzers. Similarly with reuse, again, treated wastewater is a good candidate for that, and actually has the benefit over desalination of potentially being cheaper, but then you do need the availability of that wastewater collection and the volume of wastewater to be able to actually use. Then there are a couple of questions on this topic, so I'm going to try and combine some of these. There's one on what are the biggest challenges in environmental terms for the desal industry, considering current and future legislation? And I believe there was another one on marine life impacts and how that's addressed in seawater intakes. I think these are quite closely connected. Again, this is something we cover in the report, and it's something that we'll be looking at in the 5 challenges for desalination session at GWS. In terms of environmental impacts for desal, there are a few sides to this. One, of course, is the decarbonisation angle, which is connected to reducing energy consumption. This has been a drive for a long time because of the goal to try and reduce costs, with energy consumption being a large component of that. And as I showed with the chart earlier in this presentation, that's come down quite drastically in recent years. But also the brine management side is one to consider, and it's something that's been a bit of a hot topic recently as to what does it mean to have large volumes of brine being discharged from a seawater desal plant. And there have been quite a few different perspectives offered on this. Certainly at the lab scale, it's very true that increased salinity can be very bad for marine life, but in practice, there are already a number of steps that are taken by plant designers to ensure that this impact is mitigated as much as possible. And this comes from the implementation of things like diffusers, the potential for something like mixing the brine with further seawater or with wastewater, which is rather less common. But what we see in real world plants like in Perth, where there was a close study on this, is that actually you don't see regional impacts on salinity. The increased salinity from a desal outfall is really limited to just the area around it, and can actually encourage the growth of different types of marine life. I believe there was a sort of a type of coral that was growing with the highest salinity at Perth. But then on the subject of intakes, this is something where impingement and entrainment, so marine organisms getting caught up in the desal system or getting caught on the intakes themselves. This is something which there are permitting requirements around, particularly in areas like the US. So designers have to meet the requirements for this. This may be something which becomes more common around the world, but it's certainly something that's considered in plant design, and the different types of intake structure can try and account for this. Of course, the open intake is one way of doing this, but there are other options as well, like subsurface intakes, so slant wells, vertical beach wells, these kind of things where there's not so much of a direct link between marine organisms and the water going into the intake. So hopefully that helps to answer some of those questions. I think there's definitely not going to be enough time to go through all of these questions, so I apologize if I don't give you an answer for your question on this call. For those of you who I don't get back to right now. I will be following up with you via email over the next couple of days, so I'll make sure you get an answer for some of these. Just some very quick ones. I see there's one on, is there separated data for brackish water and seawater? Yes, there is. The way we do it on DesalData is that we try and go as granular as possible. So we actually look at a variety of other feed waters as well. So we include desalination for wastewater on river water, all of these different approaches. And the charts that I've shown here are just aggregating that together. So if you're interested in drilling down into what's really going on at the project level, if you have access to DesalData, we can absolutely provide that. I think I will probably have to get back to quite a few of you on these, as we've now gone past the hour and I don't want to go too much over. So if you have a question, as I say, that hasn't been answered, keep an eye on your inbox and I will be trying to get back to you over the next couple of days. But thank you very much for attending. I hope you found this interesting and useful. Those of you who are subscribers will be having our next webinar in March. And for those of you who are not, we'll be having another non-subscriber webinar later in the year. So I look forward to seeing you all in those, and hopefully as well at GWS, potentially at Tech Idle. So thank you very much, and yeah.